Board members, we're going to begin. Want to welcome everyone to our study session. Before we get going, there's some folks out in the audience that I haven't seen before, and so this is not what we normally do. But can we? You know what's easier? I can just take this because this is not like a talk show or anything. But I'm going to have you. I'll pass this mic. If you guys want to just stand up, I'm going to have you guys introduce yourselves and who you're with, and we'll start with Terry Shoemaker. He'll set the example, and then we'll just work. We'll pass this on back, okay?
I'm pretty sure that group knows me. Terry Shoemaker with the Utah School Boards Association and the Utah School Superintendents Association.
James Yapias, Salt Lake Education Foundation.
Lexi Cunningham, Superintendent, Salt Lake City School District.
Brock Bennett, I'm with Renaissance Learning.
Jeff Moore, I'm the VP of Sales for Renaissance, and I'm from here in Draper.
Sarah Young, Coordinator for Digital Teaching and Learning here at USBE.
Diana Sudreth, Director of Teaching and Learning here.
Liz Williams, Kindergarten Specialist here.
Christelle Estrada, Title III Immigrant, Refugee, and English Learners at USBE.
Anna Thomas, Policy Analyst with Voices for Utah Children.
Finish the room. Debbie Davis, Internal Audit Director, USBE. Tiffany Stanley, Policy Advisor with USBE.
Elizabeth Garby, United Way of Salt Lake.
Royce Van Tassel, Utah Charter Schools.
Mike Nelson, Waterford Research Institute.
Oh, we have a pass. Okay. Hey, thank you for your work, though. He keeps all of this going. The first thing on our agenda, I've got to go back to it fast. Thank you. That was good for me. Hopefully it was good for you board members. Excuse me. We are going into our strategic plan study session, and Superintendent Dixon, do you want to introduce what we're covering?
I would be happy to. I have been really excited for this study session, and as we heard from Dr. Estrada last month about how we're trying to improve outcomes for our students who are learning English as part of our strategic plan. Today we're here to talk about an equally important element, and that is literacy for all of our students, and particularly early literacy. This has been a topic of conversation amongst the board, but we haven't really strategically laid out the data, where we're at, the outcomes we're trying to get to, and strategies therein. And some of those involve legislative strategies, some are board strategies, but this has been a conversation that is a long time in coming. And you all had a discussion when you created the strategic plan to look at proficiency. It's in Education Elevated in terms of outcomes for literacy. But we're here today to really give you the full story and look very critically at our data. And I am so proud of our staff. We have an amazing literacy team led by our literacy coordinator, soon to be, thanks to your approval of her data request, soon to be Dr. Jennifer Thronson. Yeah. And that's just a little push for you, Jen, to keep you going. Next to her is the equally brilliant and talented Sarah Wiebke, who works with early literacy. And last but not least, somebody that you all know who just is amazing with data, and you'll see what she's done with numbers today to really help you get to some decision points, and that's our good friend Jamie. So the three of them are going to present to you then, again, data, look at some strategies, and then open up opportunities for you to have discussion about possibilities for the upcoming session. So Take it away, ladies.
All right, well, thank you for letting us speak here today. We're pretty excited about the opportunity that this could yield. What we'll start with today, just in terms of the overview, is starting with the data, so you know where Utah students are coming from, particularly looking at that third grade data piece, and we'll talk about why third grade is that critical point. Then we'll move on to the funding block potentials. So in the session, the public education appropriations session, they asked us to consider weaving some funds together to really look at a literacy block opportunity. So we'll kind of share some lenses around that. Then we'll talk about strategies that we could use to employ to improve our student data outcomes and kind of provide some recommendations there. Then Jamie will discuss several funding options that have been generated and try and get some more input around those funding options. And then ultimately what we'd like is for you to give us some guidance on next steps and how you would like to have us proceed. So we'll end with those kind of board recommendations and wherever you want to kind of direct us to go. In each of those sections, we'll have opportunities to stop and have you ask questions. So we'll do all the data overview, then we'll stop and say what questions do you have about the data. Then we'll move on to the funding block potential, stop for questions. That way we can keep some of the flow and also keep you on time so you can go home today, hopefully. So just know the question opportunities will come, but they'll come in as those sections close. So we're going to start with kind of seeing where you think our students are. So this is a little poll everywhere. If you've used this before, you can either use the texting information that's on the page or the web address, which is pollev.com/JenniferThrow422. And if you will choose to participate in that, it will kind of pull up here where we are. And all those. Did you want the audience to participate as well? Audience is welcome to participate if you can read that line. Or you can text Jennifer Throw, THRO422. / Yeah. And you're going to pick A, B, C, or D. A is 25% are reading on grade level, 50%, 70, or 85. And these are approximate. We have our first vote. It's working. Let me shut my email so you don't keep hearing that. Okay, we have a good mix so far. Just about 30 more seconds. Let you get in there and vote.
It's automatically done, right?
Yep. Goes in. You can change it, but yeah. Okay, we have a pretty dominating category. I'm pretty impressed with the knowledge in the room of where our students are at. So depending on the metric that you use, we are in one of those two categories. So if you look at reading on grade level as the ability to read grade level text proficiently with the comprehension, we are at the 50% mark. About 49% of our students can read on grade level by the end of third grade. The other half cannot. And if you look at DIBELS as a benchmark in terms of just having those basic early literacy skills, you're more in the 73%, at least for last year's students. So depending on which metric you're kind of falling from, either of those is correct. So let me pop back. Thank you for participating. We just wanted to start with where we are. So kind of taking into why do we care about third grade? Why is that kind of the metric you hear a lot about when you go to meetings or go to the Hill? Really, there's several reasons. Research has just really shown that students who don't read on grade level by the end of third grade are unlikely to read on grade level in the future. And so that third grade seems to be the kind of cut point. As we look at our state data, our cut point seems to be even earlier than that, and we'll share that information with you in just a moment. But in terms of just the benefits of being a proficient reader, one, it's if you can have that ability to read, you have a higher predictability of having educational and lifelong success based on that ability to read. You have the increased likelihood of graduation, but you also have a decreased likelihood of going to jail, which is always a positive, living in poverty, or having to receive or choose to receive food stamps. So you can kind of see the percentages of those that are non-readers on those particular programs. So 75% of people on food stamps are not literate, 90% on welfare are not literate, 85% of the teenagers in the DUV system are not literate. And so there's just a connection or a correlation, not necessarily a cause, but there is a connection to that. we're taking questions at the interplay.
Okay, well, it
but
has-
I will let board chair.
I just want to know,
Oh, go ahead.
sorry, it has to do with how I'm looking at the data. That's why I wanted to know. So I know that like 2/3 of the kids in the juvenile justice system are on IEPs. So does this include kids with special needs as well?
Yes, absolutely. So the whole system.
Okay.
And then 70% of adult prisoners cannot read above the 4th grade level. So you can kind of just see there is a nice connection, unfortunately, with reading and your potential for some of those less fortunate opportunities. So in terms of just really weaving this into the board strategic plan, although it falls under educational equity, obviously becoming a reader is for all, quality learning, we need to have high quality instruction. We really feel this comes down to the opportunity of systems values and really looking at this potential of the literacy block opportunity and some of the improvements we might suggest as a system for literacy improvement. Really looking at how we support our stakeholders, listening to their voices, giving them more functionality and opportunity to make their own decisions, while also providing strategies and resources and professional learning that can really help leverage those opportunities that they choose to use. So this is we see it as an opportunity to really put the system values in literacy as a priority as a state. So kind of moving into the data progression, just so you can kind of see where we currently stand from a K-3 literacy perspective. The metric that we're going to look at for this particular conversation is DIBELS. And just those of you that may be or may not be familiar, just a quick kind of rundown of how this currently plays out in our system. So the WHO, currently it's administered mandated grades 1 through 3. K is optional. If Sarah reminds me, 91%. 91% took it last year without it being mandated in kindergarten. So it's a test that our LEAs at this point are finding some great value in on their own. Why it's required as part of Rule 277406, that mandated portion. And DIBELS stands for Dynamic Indicators of Basic Early Literacy Skills. Basically, the metrics or measures they use are some of the most predictive reading skills of future academic success. So the measures that they give in kindergarten are highly predictive of your 3rd grade outcomes, your 8th grade outcomes, your 11th grade outcomes in reading. From a very early age, we can make that prediction, but we can also intervene if we know who those students are that are likely to not be successful. We can then provide that service much earlier. It indicates which ones may be at risk, not necessarily a guarantee, but it allows us, I kind of think of it as a thermometer. You give a kid a thermometer, they have a fever, but you don't know why, right? So it's just saying they might be at risk. I'm going to do some other things to kind of check, or when you go get your blood pressure taken at the doctor's office and they're like, ooh, it's high. They don't just like send you home. They go, let's run a few other tests, right? And that's kind of DIBELS, just gives you the risk, like, oh boy. But we do some other things to make sure that risk is really there and maybe what are the causes. And then it also predicts future academic performance. So DIBELS has been a good tool for us as a state. We're happy to have that tool in place to really support teachers and kids in their work. So this is our last year's kind of outcomes of where students started and where they ended. So the first column is kindergarten, and then it works its way to 3rd grade. On the far left in the navy blue is the beginning of year, how kids came into us at the beginning of the year. Middle of the year is in the green, and then the light blue on the right of each column or set of data is the end of year. So you'll see in kindergarten about 61% of our students came in proficient according to DIBELS. And then by the end of the year, we had about 70%. So we were able to move about 9% of children from below proficient to proficient. Entering into 1st grade, you'll see a little higher at the beginning, but we ended a little lower. So 63% to 68%. 2nd grade, you'll see a dip. 2nd grade has been a consistent area longitudinally that we see a flat line in our state. I see hands. Okay.
I want to recognize Vice Chair Brittany Cummins.
Sorry, this is a data question as well. So do I understand correctly that the beginning of your data in kindergarten or any of the grades that it actually is different than the end of year, so they actually recognize progress over the year? Is that correct?
Yeah, so in terms of the measures that are used, they change throughout the year in K1 and 2, but the composite score, the score that comes out, is equivalent at each measure. So in terms of the data points that go into it are different, but the overall score is equivalent across. Good question. And then the last one, 3rd grade, you can see 71 to 73. In general, our data has looked like this for many years, looking at it from longitudinal. So you can see the best chance you have of becoming a reader is by the end of 1st grade. We have 68%. You have about a 5% increase between first and third grade. But basically, if you don't become a reader by the end of first grade in our state, you have a low percentage of becoming a reader. That is not a good thing. We really want to look at how we can improve that system because we need all our students reading, not 49%, which we'll talk about here in a moment. Here's the longitudinal look, just so you're going to see in this cohort of students in 1 through 3, how has that performance been. Going back to 2013 and up till present time, you can kind of see we grew from 74 to about 75 by 2015, and we have dipped back down the last few years. So our height was in 2015 with 75%, still a gap that we would want to close, but we are down to 71% in grades 1 through 3 being proficient according to DIBELS. Here's just third grade, so you can kind of see that really critical year that we know if we don't get students there by that time. We started off higher when we started this in 2013, collecting this data at 75. We got up to 78% in 2015, and we have seen a steady decline the last couple of years, down to 73%. This is a cohort look. Sometimes when you look at data like this, it's hard to know where did the kids come in compared to where they ended. And so we like to look at them in cohorts. So the youngest cohort that we have is the 2015 graduates of third grade, moving to 16, 17. That first data point on there in the blue is where they came into first grade at. Then moving into the next column is where they ended first grade in that orange, and you'll see substantial increases from beginning of first grade to end of first grade. After that, you'll notice the increases stop to be as steady, especially in the last couple of years. So this is where we're looking at the saying, first grade seems to be our kind of trouble point where if we get you there, we are unlikely to move you after that in second and third grade. You'll see that flat line in 2017's cohort. Whoever was proficient at the end of first grade, basically that percentage of students is staying the same across the years. This is the disaggregated group, just looking at the different populations that we have and considering how they're in relationship to the state average. So on the far left is the state average group. So you can kind of see the last 5 years that we just looked at. And then looking at each of the disaggregated groups across, starting with low income, minority, students with disabilities, mobile, and English learners. You'll see the same thing you're seeing in the state average data is decline in all of those populations across the board. Give you just a moment to take that in before we proceed. It's a lot of data. One of the most drastic you'll notice is mobile. From 2014, we had 61%, and as of last year, we had 47%. So we're seeing some mobile or students that move from one school to another many times. I think, 160 days of membership. Okay, so they could just move once if it was after the 20 days. Okay. Now, a lot of people question us, like, why DIBELS? And so we like to compare this to SAGE to say, well, is DIBELS telling us who's going to pass SAGE? So this particular table just shows you the correlation between DIBELS proficiency and their proficiency on SAGE. So if you pass DIBELS, how likely are you to pass SAGE? And that's what this metric shows. So we have the last 2 years of data using the composite score from DIBELS. And basically a third grader who's proficient in DIBELS has a 0.736 correlation or a 0.741 correlation to passing SAGE. So any of you that are statistically focused, that's a pretty good statistical value. It's a strong correlation between proficiency on DIBELS and SAGE. So we feel pretty confident using DIBELS as kind of a predictor measure. Obviously, it's not a one-to-one correlation, so we could still have some room to grow there, but 0.74 is pretty good for two tests that aren't aligned to each other explicitly. Then coming to kind of looking at SAGE growth over time, it is an area, unlike DIBELS, that we're seeing a decline is we're actually seeing a slight incline in SAGE performance. So over the last 4 years, we've gone up 4% from 45.5 being proficient to 49. Which is interesting to note. We're seeing a little incline, but 4% in 4 years really is not significant increase. So one of the things that we looked at is,
Sorry.
I will go back. We're going to pause after the data section. If you don't, so if you want to take notes and so we don't lose those questions, we want them to answer. We wanted to look at, DIBELS also provides us a Lexile measure. And if you're not familiar with Lexiles, they're a readability, kind of how difficult is the text that the student's reading. And so we looked at a third grade reader, what level of difficulty of text should they read? How many of our students are reading at that level of difficulty proficiently and with comprehension? And in our state, 49% of the students are reading on grade level. in terms of reading on grade level, the difficulty of text the core expects. And so about half of our students are not reading where they need to be, and about half are. So 1 and 2 is a percentage that I think you probably as a board would not want to speak for you. It's probably not where we want to be as a state. And so we're really looking at how do we improve this? How do we change outcomes so that 1 and 2 third graders are not leaving our classrooms going into 4th grade, not ready to read the more complex material that happens in 4th grade. So we want to stop there and allow you to ask questions about the data, anything that kind of comes to mind or that you wanted some clarifying, and I can always go back to slides as needed.
Okay. Board Member Reby?
Mm-hmm.
So as I look at
Mike Reby.
as I look at English language learners and I am familiar with the DIBELS test, part of me wonders if this test being available in multiple languages might change that data. Is that a possibility?
They have it in Spanish. It is available, DIBELS Spanish, there is a version. I think it depends on what we would like to measure in terms of performance. So are we, one, wanting to measure, do they have literacy skills in a language? Or are we looking to measure, do they have literacy skills in English, which is the target language of instruction? Because our ELs come with skill sets that we don't measure in these ways oftentimes. It just depends on what kind of metrics you want available. DIBELS does have a Spanish, but it would be difficult to get that a test like that in many languages to kind of meet the needs in Utah. But I'm sure there's a number of them that would be available.
You have a follow-up?
Nope.
Okay. Other question? Vice Chair Brittany, comments?
So on, I think it's the 2 slides previous to this where it looks at data over time. And both of them indicate, you know, kind of a decline in progress over the years. And I know it's impossible to kind of say why did that happen, but what is the process of beginning that investigation of what's changed over that time period?
Yeah, we look at what kinds of initiatives came, what kinds of changes in the dollar amounts that are even being received. So, for example, when this program first started, every student was about $85 a student. We're down to $77 because there has not been growth in this program. So you've lost a few dollars, probably not drastic, but it's still, the districts and charters feel that. Another piece is we have seen over the last couple of years increased software usage and declines in student achievement. So are we seeing a correlation there? I don't know, but we have seen a significant number of students participating in software with a decline in student performance. Some of that's we'll talk about later is application of when that software is being used and how it's being used. Software has its place, but maybe some of the practices we're seeing in the field are not probably the best practices around how to employ software in functional, effective ways. So we'll definitely be bringing that up in terms of strategies to improve. We have some suggestions for later in the presentation from what we've seen from their Utah Consolidated applications, what LEAs say they're doing for students, and how we can, and what we know from going out in the field and meeting with teachers and districts. What we're seeing are some commonalities across the state of how to improve this data. So that's coming later in the presentation, like some specific strategies that we think would be effective for changing student outcomes so we can get off of this plateau/decline that we're currently on.
Any further questions? Board Member Lisa, comments?
Were you aware of the audit that the legislative team just presented yesterday? Could that be one of the problems, like you mentioned, like there's an overlap of programs here and money going to various programs, and there's not really a way to measure all, where one specific program is working, where one is not. Absolutely. Could that be a huge problem with what's going on here?
Yeah, so as we look at what one potential we're going to offer today is the weaving of some funds to really say, let's be strategic. Let's let the LEAs choose which strategies are most effective for them. What tactics do they want to use to improve student literacy achievement with some parameters that we know need to be put into place, but giving them more local flexibility because currently you have to spend it in these 3 ways. And so we're going to get into some specificity there to try and loosen up the strategies so that they can have more cohesiveness and think about how do these strategies interweave, because right now they are separate entities upon themselves. And the audit did a really good job of laying out the issues with having 3 initiatives that currently all are trying to improve early literacy, but they're all in their own separate house right now. So as we move forward, we'll be talking with you about weaving those funding sources together and allowing the LEAs to decide where do they want to spend their energies, their strategies, their time, their efforts that are making the most sense in their LEAs. What strategies have they seen work for them? And where would they like to kind of ramp up? And where would they like to be able to say, you know, we're not going to employ that strategy. It hasn't been effective for us. We want to move those dollars in our own, you know, funding block to something that's been more effective for us as an LEA. So that's definitely, we're headed there.
Okay.
Thank
so
you for bringing that.
May I have a
follow up?
second question? Have you, with teaching methods specifically, have you found that a lack of teaching phonics specifically has made a huge impact, and should we be bringing that back into the classroom?
Yeah, so one of our recommendations will be to express the 7 key areas that literacy instruction needs to occur in. Phonemic awareness and phonics are our 2 lowest deficits in the state. We don't do them well, we don't do them as explicitly as they require, and we don't provide as much practice as needed. It is an area that needs some significant attention. We would have much better outcomes given that fact. I mean, when I came into the board 3.5 years ago, we had districts that still didn't even have phonics programs. We've known since 2000 we need phonics. So we have a little ways to go, but that's definitely an area I'd like to see us kind of make sure that people are spending some time and energy. All right, so.
I think Board Member Cannon or Reby, is your light on? Oh, Board Member Reby.
So my daughter supported my campaign because I told her that I might help diminish DIBELS testing. She really dislikes DIBEL testing. And my experience is, and I'm wondering, is this district specific or state specific? Are we requiring kids to take DIBEL tests all the way to 6th grade? And at what point do we allow them to display mastery? Because if we keep giving the same test and showing that they have mastery from grade to grade, it's kind of a wasted resource. So
gotcha.
I'm confused by that.
So currently in legislation, grades 1 through 3 are mandated. So kindergarten's optional, 4 through 6 is not mandated in any way, it's optional. A number of LEAs choose to test 4 through 6, and we met with the literacy directors last week, and they actually requested for us to look at mandating in 4 through 6 with that caveat of if the student is blue or in that highest level, we no longer need to check them. So it's meant to be a screener of who's at risk. If you know they're no longer at risk, do you need to continue to give an assessment that you already know what the result is going to be? And that was part of the conversation, is really looking at who should be screened. In the early grades, you screen everyone because the measures change in the metrics. But as you move up through the system, you don't need to know that 6th grader is a proficient reader after 7 years of data of proficient reading. And so that is definitely part of the conversation.
Got a follow-up?
A follow-up.
So with the progress monitoring, I would like to follow the data on the progress monitoring of our kids that are still struggling, but exit the ones that are proficient out.
Absolutely. So in terms of benchmarking, we could put some kind of ties around who would need to be required, and then leave some options up to the LEA as to whether, you know, who else they might want, but here's kind of your minimum. And then in terms of progress monitoring, we benchmark 3 times a year. That's what's required. Progress monitoring is optional at this point in our state. The LEAs that are progress monitoring have better literacy outcomes. So our higher performing districts have more progress monitoring happening in their LEAs. So it's an interesting connection that we've seen over the past 3 years with the DIBELS data we've collected. Those that do progress monitor have better student outcomes because they're able to respond to how students are responding to instruction more quickly than those that only benchmark the 3 times a year. So it's an interesting, I can show you the data if you'd like to see it. It's been interesting to see the correlation between progress monitoring and student outcomes in those LEAs.
Okay.
So
another follow-up.
DIBELS has many different tests. Are we I've seen a pattern across my district where the informational text and comprehension is a big problem. Is it going to be managed? What part of this DIBELS test are we asking people to do? Is it just the fluency component? Is it the comprehension?
It's the whole battery to get the composite score. So
and the nonsense words as well.
So it's retail, fluency, and the days for like the upper elementary kiddos, and then all the nonsense word and phonics pieces in the elementary. Okay. So we require all. The battery generally between 6 and 5 to 8 minutes generally is how long it takes per student to test.
Board Member Lisa, comment.
Just a quick thought. Have you considered maybe the physical development or the mental development of a child? So maybe they may not be reading at 3, but by 3rd grade, but they could be finally kick in at 5th grade.
Yeah, so that's one of the things that we want to talk with you all today is, do we continue to keep a focus only on K3, or do we allow for students to be served in the K elementary space? K5, K4, K6, whatever the system may be. We have some students at 3rd grade shouldn't be the end of service. And unfortunately, there's no state dollars that go towards providing intervention for students who don't make it by the end of 3rd grade currently. So this would be an opportunity to allow LEAs to still focus their dollars on K3, and we can put some guardrails around that, whatever you think might be sufficient, but to give some flexibility to serve students in 4 through 6, because we do have 20, 30, 40, 50% of kids not reading at grade level, yet there's not the resources being able to be used in those grade levels. So that is definitely a suggestion for improvement that we're going to share with you soon. I'm going to take you into what we're proposing.
We got one other quick question. Board Member Hanson.
Oh, I missed the light, so sorry.
That's okay.
I miss the light quite often. Come to the light.
But we just, wave.
Okay.
So I think, personal experience, I think that's really important. My son, special ed son, he is 20 now, and he's just starting to like reading in post-high.
That changes.
And, but they kind of gave up after 3rd grade when he wasn't reading fluently. They just kind of, until he got somebody who was, oh, maybe he can do it. And now he's really excited about it. So I think it's important.
It's never too late to learn to read.
It's never too late. Yeah.
It's predictive of 3rd grade, but it's not that we can't change their trajectory. It's just it takes more energy, efforts, and resources than maybe are typically provided or allotted for. So what we want to kind of propose is that our data is what it is. It's definitely not the story I think we would want to continue to have in Utah. And so one of the opportunities brought up first by the legislature, and we kind of went, sounds like a good idea overall. So it would be to take those currently individual funding sources and weave them together. So in front of you, you have a sheet with the key terms. These will be the 4 funding sources we're referring to today. There'll be options amongst those 4. Maybe we only want to combine 3 of the 4, or maybe we want to only do 2. Those are just the current funding sources that have potential for doing some weaving to really focus our efforts on improving literacy outcomes in Utah. So to start with, you have those 4 programs. The first one's the K3 reading. It's the $15 million that is split out through the districts through a base allocation and then based on their free and reduced lunch. And that's really with the goal of having all 3rd graders read. And each LEA employs those in their own ways, but really targeted towards reading improvement. Currently, 96% of those dollars goes towards salary and benefits for things like instructional coaches, reading specialists, and paraprofessionals. That's where most of the folks are spending their money at this time. The second potential funding source for the literacy block of weaving these sources into one coherent system so that LEAs can really focus their work and determine what strategies will work best is early intervention, or also known as OEK, your full day or extended kindergarten options. Currently, we have $7.5 million that is going into that particular project. At the LEA level or at the district level, that is a certain allocation given to each one. The charter is a grant application, so it's a little bit different. In some LEAs at this point, they don't get enough dollars to run a program, so they're having to supplement that particular resource. But this has been one that the LEAs have felt very confident that this strategy is working for them in really great ways. The next one is the early intervention software. That's a $7.6 million allocation. That comes to the state currently. This would put those dollars in the hands of the local LEAs and allow them to choose how they, again, want to spend any of those dollars, with the potential that they can continue whatever software they've been using currently and continue that practice if that's what they decide. And the last one, which might be a little extension upon the current literacy funds, is the class size reduction. And the reason we kind of weave that one in as a potential opportunity is that currently over 50% of those dollars is going towards the early K2 space. It's required. And then you can, as an LEA, they can choose where else they might need it based on their populations and enrollment. But currently, a lot of those dollars are already being spent in early literacy. This is one that's potentially likely to get rolled up into the WPU. And so we thought this might be an opportunity to snag it before that happens and really use it to invest in early literacy and elementary outcomes. So those are kind of the 4 sources we're going to talk about today. Jamie's going to take you through potential of, well, if we only did 3 of these, or if we did all 4, and how could we do the base allocation? She'll take you through that near the end. But just so you know what kind of funding sources we're talking about, combining to make this cohesive literacy block system.
Sure.
So in terms of the, I see one.
Member Cannon.
wanted to ask a question on the third one, early intervention software. Are you talking about the Upstart program?
No, so Upstart is a different one. This is our 7 other providers for K through 3. So Upstart's our pre-K program.
Okay.
This is our K3
so
software.
We wouldn't be fouling that program.
No, Upstart would be remaining.
Thank you.
All right, so in terms of just potential, the benefits of this and how we kind of see the weaving of these funds as one cohesive system would be probably the number one reason is increased flexibility at the local level. So lots more local control of how they spend their dollars, because currently OEK has to go to OEK. Software has to go to software. They don't have as much flexibility in how they spend those dollars. Now, if they want to continue those strategies, they absolutely could under this new model, but this would give them the opportunity to think, which strategy is working well for us? What do we want to continue to employ? What do we want to ramp up? And what do we maybe want to take off? The next one is provides opportunities to expand services. This would be a board recommendation, if you guys feel comfortable, would be to expand this beyond K3 to allow elementary students to be served, because we know a middle school student who can't read is extremely challenging when you get to middle school, that we would like to provide as much support as we can. We could still put some parameters to keep it focused on K3, but to allow some of the funding to be used to serve students who are not reading at grade level by the end of 3rd grade. It would reduce some inefficiency. So currently, the LEAs have to report on their K3 reading. They have to report on their early intervention. They have to provide an application process for early reading software. There's a lot of reporting. Class size reduction is another report. This would reduce it down to 1 report, which all the LEAs, I would assume, would not mind 1 versus 4. Mathematically, it sounds nice. Obviously, there'd be some specifics in there that might make that report a little longer than 1 of them, but not all 4 of them in combined. The next one encourages development of a coherent, comprehensive literacy strategy. The expectation is if we were to do this, this would not go into place until the 2019-20 school year, so that they would have a full year to really ramp up and work as a district to determine, or a charter, how do we want to expend these funds in the most strategic way possible. So they would have a good amount of planning time to really think, how can we use these best to serve our students? The next one enhances ability to evaluate and scale up best practices. If we were, allowing them to choose what strategies they see working in their LEA, they could scale those up much more quickly than currently with those 3 different individualized funding sources. And the last one, probably the one I'm most passionate about, is it protects and safeguards literacy as a state priority. With the opportunity that this money could be rolled into the WPU, it kind of gives a message that literacy is no longer a state priority, because we no longer have a dedicated funding source to literacy if these programs were to be rolled up into the WPU, which has been put on the options that Jamie has to send into the legislature. What would that look like? And so really saying with this literacy block is Utah cares about literacy, the state board cares about literacy, the legislature cares, and we are going to continue investing dollars dedicated to improving literacy outcomes in our state. So those are the potential benefits of such a literacy block piece. Questions?
Okay. Board Member Reeby.
I have spoken to some of my constituents, and they are really concerned about rolling it up into WPU. I was wondering if you're going to cover the pros and cons, and what are some of maybe the unintended consequences that people have expressed when we do each option?
Yeah.
And you have a list.
So part of that will come in with the financial options, is how much will the WPU increase? Where will people lose money? Jamie has some really tight numbers on that particular portion. And I think the biggest part that we heard from several superintendents emailed me and were concerned about this opportunity to roll it in the WPU because it's hard for them to safeguard literacy money when they have so many other demands coming at them. Salary, benefits, those go up every year, and finding sources for those. even though they might value literacy greatly, it's hard to protect those dollars when it's in a big pot that everybody else is coming for as well. And so they were concerned that I had several email me and say, hey, we're not so sure about this idea. And I said, well, I'm not sure how likely it is, not knowing, but it is potential for them to be able to talk to the legislators around what that might look like. But Jamie has the proposal of what it would look like.
So Jennifer, where we're at on this, if as I've gone through your slides and that, it looks like that discussion that Kathleen's talking about is more on the end of.
Yeah, absolutely.
What are our options? Where do we go with this?
Yeah, we're going to need a lot
in those proposals, can you express some of the feedback that you've heard from each of those different proposals and not just like the numbers, maybe? Share what you've heard from our LEAs and our charters. Thanks.
All right. Okay. Any other questions?
We're good.
All right, here we go. All right, so in terms of thinking about with this literacy block opportunity, reinforcing what we are seeing are effective strategies is one thing that we could do within the literacy block legislation language or the board rule. So currently some things that are working really well, and we asked the literacy directors and we took our own kind of perceptions around the field, instructional coaching. So instructional coaches are a major source of the money that goes into K-3 reading, really having coaches there to support teachers in high quality core instruction in their own classrooms so that they're able to do job embedded coaching, which is one of the most effective models we can have for professional learning. The second one that's going well is intervention supports being provided. So paraprofessionals, reading specialists are in many buildings to provide extra intervention support for students who are not achieving at the levels desired. Extended day kindergarten is one that the LEAs will tell you is working really well. We ran a report last year, and I'd be happy to send it out to you all, to compare students who were being served an extended day, who came in, below benchmark or well below, in comparison to their peers who weren't able to be afforded the opportunity to participate in full day or extended day. When we talk extended day, it could be 30 minutes, like cash runs. It could be a full day model, like Washington County runs. North to south, it just totally varies what their models look like, but they all have outcomes that are significant. When we looked at the state data, the students who are able to have the opportunity to participate in full day that demonstrate risk outperform their peers who don't have the opportunity to participate in full day. So it's definitely a strategy we're seeing strong in the data of seeing that opportunity. Again, optional. It's never going to be a mandated. Kindergarten's not even mandated, but it's an optional opportunity for students at risk.
Okay.
Vice
I
Chair
just wanted to
Clark.
clarify, but you just did at the end that it's for students at risk.
Yes. The next one is DIBELS screening assessment. That's one thing that the literacy directors felt very passionate about, that has been going well for them, that they feel like their teachers, we've been doing a lot of professional learning the last couple of years, getting teachers to use that more strategically, and that seems to be changing the conversations in LEAs. No longer is it, well, I provided an intervention. It's, I provided an intervention and here's how it's working, because our system now tells you how effective that intervention is serving that student and allows you to adjust your instruction much more quickly than in the past we were able to do so. And then the last one thing that we see working across the state are evidence-based programs that demonstrate that they have worked somewhere, and when you employ them in such a way that they should also work within our population. We've got to get people away from Pinterest and teacher pay teachers when we're really looking at intervening with students in strategic quality ways. And so we've noticed the districts that have those evidence-based programs have better outcomes and intervention supports for their students. In terms of the challenges, so that was all the positive. The challenges are numerous, just as well as the positives. And ineffective application of the early intervention software. So one of the things we're seeing is the data is not super strong in terms of student outcomes of how students are performing who get to use the software. They do outperform their peers who don't in general for fidelity, but it's not in a it's significant in terms of statistical significance. But for example, 0.22 is many of the outcomes. A 0.22 is like sitting at home over the summer. I'm not sure that's what we're hoping for in our school systems. Part of that comes down to not necessarily an ineffective software program, but an ineffective application of the software. So oftentimes it'll turn into a babysitter, like 30 minutes on the computer while teacher goes and grades papers, which I know they have papers to grade. But what we're seeing in terms of effective application is the teachers walking around, looking at how the students are doing. They're pulling off their reports. They're pulling kids and teaching them the skills that they don't have based on those reports and allowing the student to continue. Because software can only go so far. It can scaffold so much, and then it says, hey, teacher, we need you. They often have lesson plans that teachers can use, but we're not seeing the software being employed in ways that it could be to potentially see those outcomes happen. You have something to add?
Superintendent.
Yeah, I briefly mentioned this yesterday in my remarks, but this was something as I visited all of the districts that I reported on yesterday, I could see such a significant and strategic difference where teachers were weaving this into really good tier 1 instruction. They were using technology as part of the instruction, and students could really articulate what they were learning from the technology in those spots. And they were few, but once in a while you'd walk into a classroom and there was a lot of stuff buzzing. There was a lot of technology, but not always could the students tell you what they were learning from it. They were, there was, I didn't see that very frequently. More often than not, I saw a teacher really integrating it into their instruction. But you can see the difference when you walk into a classroom where it's using time versus used for learning.
And it's an opportunity that could be turned around. We need our teachers just to learn how to use technology in more effective ways. But currently, with how things are being applied, they're not as effective as they could be.
Vice Chair. Or not Vice Chair. Board Member Lisa Cummins has
I'm not a vice
question.
chair.
Not yet.
Not yet. One concern, do you know or do you have a list of vendors that they're learning from the software? Because I walked into one classroom and their program was Super Y to learn to read, and I'm just like,
that's not one of our state programs.
because that concerned me, yes, you can identify letters and Super Y is all fun and grand and everything, but Yeah,
the programs in general that we have on board right now have gone, especially the last few years, have gone through, you have to be research and evidence-based, and it has to be an external evaluation. It can't be the company providing like, oh yeah, we're great, but an external evaluator finding, oh yeah, we're great. So in terms of the programs we have on house right now, there's a new RFP that should be released in January to kind of either continue with the vendors we have or add to the vendors or decrease the vendors depending on what comes in. But really looking at, do they have evidence that what they're doing works for kids? And that's the heavy point in the RFPs is, do you have valuable evidence that's not your internal people saying, yes, this works, but external evaluators saying that your program works to change outcomes? Yeah, I mean, the websites, there's some use, if again, used in strategic ways. All right, the next one, and probably the most rampant, I would say, is the misalignment of intervention to students' identified needs. So, for example, if a student demonstrates low proficiency in fluency, the automatic assumption is we should give a fluency intervention. Well, there's a lot of things that underride whether you're a fluent reader or not that don't come down to rate or speed or accuracy. Some of it comes down to being able to read the words on the page, which is more of a phonics skill. And so really helping align our interventions to the specific student needs, it needs to be coached. There needs to be some training and some supports around, if a student has a profile like this, here are some strategies to kind of do, or here's some diagnostic tools to dig in and figure out where should you align your interventions. Right now, students are getting whatever material might be in the building, or it seems to fit their need, but we're not drilling down far enough to really know what the identified need is so that we can meet that need more quickly. The next one is lack of quality training and materials. A lot of that comes down to time for the training. It's not so much that the training they're receiving is not quality, it's that they don't get a lot of it. We've lost professional development days over the years, and so more opportunities to have that professional learning. I was with a group of principals yesterday, and the presenter asked them, how many of your teachers are proficient at teaching reading? And 2 of the principals in the room raised their hand out of 50. That to me tells the story. We have a lot of work to do in reading, that if our principals are seeing that their teachers are not super comfortable and confident in teaching reading, we have some work to do in terms of teacher preparation, but also professional learning during the in-service years. The next one is lack of understanding of assessment data. We have a lot of data, as you all know. There's plenty of data. We're data rich, but we're information poor in some ways. We're not quite sure how to use that data in meaningful, timely ways, and so some work on allowing the LEAs to provide some professional learning on how to use assessment data to move student performance. And then the lack of adequate teacher preparation. We still have universities in the state that don't teach phonics, as Board Member Cummins brought up, to our incoming teachers. So we're expecting teachers to teach a skill that they did not receive any preparation for in preparation to become a teacher. And so we have some gaps that we would like to fill in working with our universities. We've already reached out a little bit just because our university folk is already working on some of these things, and they were very interested in the opportunity to look at what they're currently providing. So in terms of just potential uses for this literacy block idea, we kind of group them into 4 main categories, and we're going to go into each of these in more depth. The first one's curriculum, next one would be core instruction support, next would be intervention, and finally assessment. Really looking at how could these funding sources be used in ways that we know will produce literacy outcomes. So the first one would be curriculum. And this would be putting some language into either board rule or legislation that requires them to use scientifically based or evidence-based programs. That is one of your initiatives. It is not currently in legislation nor in board rule that they have to be using some things that we know work already. It'd be really nice to have that kind of language in there. Not saying we need to put out the list of programs necessarily, but that they would know that those are requirements. When they go to purchase something, it needs to be scientifically based or evidence-based. It would need to be in one of these 7 key areas as well. Literacy is not a world that we don't know a lot about. At this point, we know what works. It is not a question. The question is employing what we know works. And so really looking at those 7 key areas of what evidence has shown, those are the things that affect literacy outcomes. So phonological awareness, phonics, vocabulary, fluency, oral language, comprehension, and writing. And then the next point, in terms of that evidence-based, scientifically based curriculum, would be still allowing for that intervention software that supports core or intervention needs. Some of the LEAs said, hey, our core program has software we would like to be able to use, or at least be able to purchase with these dollars, or maybe it's the intervention software we currently have in place that they could continue with. The next one would be allowable use for core instruction support. So again, core instruction, they're already affording for at the local level, but being able to support that core instruction. So this would be where your literacy coaches would come in, your professional learning opportunities that would need to be data-driven and aligned to the professional learning standards that we have as a state, that we would have some recommendation of the number of minutes of minimum of literacy instruction. There's thousands of research studies on more time means better outcomes. We have some LEAs that give 55 minutes. The research is much closer to 90 to 120 minutes, and 55 minutes is just not enough time to get the job done. So having some recommendations from the board, not like they'd be flexible, but some recommendations might be helpful. That their instructions align to the core standards, that they use whole and small group differentiation, and with the potential if class size does get rolled in here, that they could continue using class size reduction funds to reduce class sizes. We all know 34 kindergartners is not a happy space for anybody. So having that opportunity to say, hey, we're going to use some of these dollars to keep this class size down. The other component would be, though, some professional learning. If you're going to say, well, we want to take this class of 29 and bring you down to 15, great. But what we're seeing is teachers continue to teach the same way. We need some professional learning of how you change your instruction when you have 15 from 29 or so on. It's kind of at that point of class size doesn't have an effect when you don't change how you teach. And so we'd have to really look at allowing the LEAs to provide professional learning on how to use class size effectively. The next one is intervention. This would be continued use as is now to provide intervention support through paraprofessionals, reading specialists, other staff as appropriate. Professional learning. One of the things that's great to have a curriculum, you need to train people how to use the curriculum. And so having those opportunities to train your paraprofessionals or your reading specialists on how to use those tools. The professional learning would be data-driven. I saw a finger. Should I pause?
We have a question here or a comment from Board Member Reeby.
So we discussed in finance extended day kindergarten, and I would like to see an equity piece there. Right now we have it funded for Title I schools and lower income demographics, and then we also have people that are higher end demographic that can afford to pay for it themselves. We have a big chunk of people in the middle that have no opportunity for all-day kindergarten. I would like to see that maybe we could work on extending it so that every demographic across the state has an opportunity to have that if they wanted it.
Yeah, I think the tight point right now is you have 40% of kids who need it and 20% can get it because of the funding allowed currently. with the potential of class size being rolled up, you could expand the opportunity to allow for more students to have the option. I know Canyons has allowed for that sliding scale to allow more students to enroll in full day through a paid model. Again, it's all optional. That's the point of our optional extended day, is that you get to choose whether you want your student in full day or half day. And no day if that's what you choose as well in terms of kindergarten. But that might be some potential to allow for that, but we can also look at some language that would provide some targeted areas for support in extended day, because it is a strategy that is working in our state very well. We just need to see some increased funding to allow more students to accept it. Okay, all right. Other thoughts? Okay. Extended learning time. So these are current things that are allowed for in our legislation programs across the three. And then the last part would be targeted interventions focused to the student area of need, guided by data for diagnostic, progress monitoring, and observational assessment, using data to tell you what kinds of interventions a kid needs, and being really strategic with that. And the last component would be assessment. So allowing this last allowable use is adaptive assessments, including software components that allow for teachers to know where students are so they can provide targeted instruction. Diagnostic tools. Some of our LEAs, we had the meeting with them last week, and they're like, what do you use? Some of them don't even have tools for that. So helping them to either find those tools or give some guidance. Progress monitoring tools, formative assessment, and then professional learning on data analysis and adjustments in instruction. Our teachers, some of them are in need of knowing how to use their data to adjust instruction and to know if it's working for students. We would also propose within this allowable uses changing the accountability formula. So currently, if an LEA fails to meet their reading goal, after 2 years, they lose their funding. We would like to see that part changed and really look at this as an opportunity to provide support rather than penalizing LEAs that can't achieve those outcomes, but providing increased levels of support to help them achieve those outcomes. The current target is third grade. Pathways of progress levels, typical or better. So a third grader, there's a certain expectation that they make so much progress in that year, and that is measured through DIBELS and our pathways of progress. And we are looking for the 47.83% of that third grade population to make typical or better progress. If you look at that goal, it is relatively low. We set it there as a board probably a year or two ago for a couple of reasons. We didn't have longitudinal data to tell us where we were. We have that now. And we also had the catastrophic, you lose your funding after 2 years if you fail. And to pull funding from an LEA that's having a struggle helping kids learn to read seemed kind of counterproductive. And so the board was like, let's go with this target. We're asking to raise that target with this proposal. So it would be taking into account grades 1 through 3 instead of just third grade, but bringing in first and second grade, because as you've seen in our data, first grade seems to have some movement, then we flatline in second grade and have a little bounce in third grade. We need to have all those grades responsible for helping kids learn to read. And currently, third grade is the accountability year, but we really know it takes more than 1 year to get kids to reading. We would stick with the same metric of that pathways of progress, typical or better, but move the target significantly, probably closer to 60 from looking at our data. And we'll kind of show you why we would probably start there. So here is if we were to raise the rigor and include grades 1 through 3, our state average is at 66. 66% of our kids make typical or better progress in grades 1 through 3. If we move the target to 60%, we would have 17 LEAs fail, including 3 school districts. And you can see as we continue to raise a percentage point, how many more would fail over time. Due to our limited capacity at the state board to help that many LEAs, that would probably be the constraint in starting with 60, is how many LEAs can you truly support at once. 17 is a lot, and 3 school districts, and they are rather large school districts, would need to be supported. So just keeping that in mind, the proposal around accountability would be part of that, contingency on those funds, that you're using them appropriately and you're having student outcomes, but really raising the rigor of what we expect our LEAs to be doing. To have less than a half of your kids make typical or better progress in third grades is a little low of a bar. So questions about allowable uses and potential and accountability?
Vice Chair Brittany, comment.
Is it correct that currently the only program that you mentioned in the 4 is that the K-3 reading? Is that the only one where this accountability applies to now?
Yes, you are correct. Yes.
But your proposal is to lump them all together and have the same accountability for all that funding.
Correct. Yes.
Okay, please continue.
All right. All right. The last part, I'm going to hand it over to Jamie. So I'm going to pause on this, and she's going to take you through.
Oh, hang on one sec.
Oh, sorry.
Remember
No,
reading.
You're fine.
What are the measures we are using to use accountability? Is it just DIBELS, or is it?
It currently is just DIBELS, so that could be some more conversation too. Currently, we use DIBELS third grade composite scores and typical or better progress.
But is it just if they're on grade level or not on grade level, or do you
No,
measure
we
growth?
we actually it's growth.
Okay.
So we used to be a proficiency model. In the last couple of years, we went to a growth model to really say, well, we know they may not make proficient because we've seen our data, but we want to make sure kids are making adequate growth towards their targets. And so changing it from a proficiency model to typical or better growth. Students who are on the very high end are automatically counted as typical or better growth because they're so far off the spectrum. But for the vast majority of students, they're added into that calculation.
Is there another measure that we can use besides DIBELS? Is there a multiple
The
lines of
trick
evidence?
from the field was really trying to bring grades 1 and 2 into the equation because what they're finding is one case is that principals are knowing where's accountability currently, 3 and up. So where do you put your most qualified teachers? 3 and up in a lot of school systems, which is leaving our K2ers to maybe not getting the quality early learning experiences that having accountability a little earlier could provide a more stable environment in the 1 through 5 space. That's one particular reason. We don't have any other metrics in 1-2 that allows for us to measure performance other than DIBELS in the state. So that's kind of the reason sticking with DIBELS at this point, because we don't have another test that first and second graders are measured on. All right, so Jamie's going to take over funding as soon as I stop sharing. And there are 7 particular options, and you have them on that last slide if you're looking at the presentation. She's going to take you into the spreadsheet.
At the last public ed appropriations meeting, 4 of the programs on a list that are not to be included in the base budget this year are the 4 programs that we're going to go over right now. Class size reduction, K3, reading improvement, early intervention or OEK, and then the early intervention software. Those 4 programs were, the motion was made to leave them out of the base budget for fiscal year 19. For further discussion. One of those discussion points is to possibly roll them into the value of the WPU. So what this sheet goes over and shows is program by program, if we rolled class size reduction, which is $135 million, into the value of the WPU, what would it do? Right now, it would take the WPU value from 3311 to 3477. And then it would redistribute. So right now, class size reduction is distributed the formula on a K8 ADM. So those individual LEAs that are middle school or high school that don't have K8 are not currently receiving this funding. So basically you redistribute it between all grades K-12. Anyone in pink are individual LEAs that they would be, in essence, losing funds from their current allocation. As we go across here, same thing with K3 reading improvement, which is $15 million. It would increase the WPU value to 3328 from 3311. Again, column Y will show, in essence, the winners and losers, those who get additional funding and those who would lose funding. Keep moving across. Early intervention is the $7.5 million. As Jennifer stated, that is a formula for the districts and a competitive grant for the charters. And so as you look through this list, you'll see a lot more charters gaining funds just because there's only a handful of charters that actually receive these funds due to the allocation method. So we keep moving across. The early intervention software. This is $7.6 million. As you notice in column AK, there are no pink or red figures in here because currently all LEAs, none of the LEAs receive this funding. It goes directly to vendors. So redistributing this to LEAs, all LEAs would gain funds. And the last red box is if we rolled all 4 programs into the WPU value, what would that do currently to all LEAs in our state. And the last columns are the current funding formulas and allocation amounts for each of the LEAs for fiscal year 18. So you can compare what they would get to what they would get under the scenario method of rolling everything into the WPU value.
And we have a question from board member Lisa Cummins.
So just from my notes here and just clarification, the K-3 Reading Improvement Program that receives $15 million, it's the only one that is measured for accountability, and and all this money goes directly to vendors?
No, the K-3 reading improvement goes to LEAs. It's the early intervention software, the $7.6 million that goes to vendors.
Okay, gotcha. Thank you.
Board member Belknap.
Jamie, you said something about, and I think it's two back on the charters will get a higher allocation because of the way it's funded. Why aren't they getting it now?
So the early intervention is, in statute, it says that it's allocated based on greatest need. So they run a grant program, the state charter school board does, and I believe you ratify those individuals that are given those awards. So I think it's only given, I want to say, to less than 10 charters. It's only like $800,000, I think, is what the charter piece is. And so that's distributed based on greatest need through the grant program. So when you reallocate it into the WPU, all those charters have WPUs, and so all of them are gaining funds because they're not getting it originally. So as you look down the list, and the charters that are in red are the ones that are getting a grant currently, but their dollar value is quite a bit less than what their grant award is right now. So take Guadalupe, for instance. Their grant award is much higher than the $54,000, and so they're only getting a small piece based on their WPU share. So that's the difference there.
Follow up.
So on this allocation, is it funded separately for charters and for our traditional districts? So there's a funding model that they allocate, and so the state charter board decides out of that $800,000. Okay, thank you.
Correct.
Vice Chair Brittany Cummins.
So I'm guessing the scenarios that we're going to go through, is that what this would look like if we didn't roll it into the WP, but it's blocking? Okay, then I will wait.
I was just waiting to see if there were any more questions on this, and then we would move on.
Board member Reapy.
So we're spreading this money pretty evenly right now by the enrollment or by a need?
Each program has a different funding formula, whether it's based on K8 ADM as class size reduction is, K3 is based on basically, K3 and WPUs, and your economic disadvantaged population. Early intervention has a separate formula for districts and a separate formula for charters, and then the software is not given to LEAs directly. So it just depends on which program we're talking about and to how it's distributed.
Have a follow-up.
So as we move it to putting it closer together and providing more flexibility, are we going to still keep some of the equity pieces in place so that students with higher needs are receiving more funding? Is that component going to be one of the options?
Correct. One of the options is based upon risk factors of students who are at risk of academic failure is one of the options that we did present in here.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Please continue.
Gladly. Scenario 2, as we look at these moving across, I'll kind of quickly just go over them, and then if you've got questions, please stop me. Scenario 2, if you look off to the side, I've put what funding sources we're considering here. So here for the block grant, we're considering the K3 reading improvement, which is the $15 million. Early intervention, which is the $7.5 million, and the early intervention software, which is $7.6 million, to get us a total block grant appropriation possibility of $30.1 million. How we're allocating that is we decided to do a graduated or a threshold base based on your K3 population for all of the LEAs, and then whatever is left over from that pot of $30.1 million is distributed based on your K3 student population. Also off to the side in columns H is their current funding, the LEA's current funding from those three sources, and the percent change to kind of give you something to compare to. So that's scenario 2. Scenario 3 is the same scenario in the fact that we're talking about the same pieces of funding, except that after we get a base, the remaining is distributed based on what we consider risk factors. So the risk factors that we considered from all LEAs was low income, the English language learner population, mobile, and students that had IEPs. We consider those risk factors of students who would be at risk for academic failure. So the remaining funds are distributed on those risk factors presented at each of the LEAs. Again, off to the right, you can see what their current funding allocation is from those pots and the percent change between the two scenarios. Scenario 4 is we start to consider all 4 appropriations, which means that we include class size reduction. So the $135 million from class size reduction is included in these scenarios, which means the total appropriation possibility is $165 million. Again, we did a graduated base based on your K-3 population, and then the remaining funds are distributed based on that K-3 student population. Off to the right are the percent changes between current funding and the possible scenario. Scenario 5, again, same pot, so the $165 million, but in this case, we are distributing the remaining amount based on those risk factors that we talked about earlier in the earlier scenario. And then we presented 2 additional scenarios. Both of these are based on the $30.1 million is the scenario 6. We did the graduated base this time based on risk factors. So those LEAs that had higher risk factors have a higher base, and the remaining funds are also distributed on those risk factors. And the very last scenario is including that class size reduction funds in it. Again, the entire pot is distributed based on those risk factors. These are just 6 possible scenarios for you to digest and give feedback for. Just giving you a foundation to build upon.
Board Member Hanson.
Have our LEAs seen this? Because I'm looking at this. I have 4 school districts, and some of each scenario, I've got at least one school district that's a big loser. And that hurts. Ouch. And so, have we talked to superintendents, LEAs? Are we seeing it first?
So we wanted to present it to you first. Definitely, they've seen it through a board. I know Superintendent Association Terry Shoemaker is here and has seen some of the scenarios. We came up with potential opportunities, right, taking in these funding sources. If you have class size, nobody should be hurt in some ways, because it's going to literacy now, but you're losing it from a different area. And it was employed somewhere. All of these funds are employed in some place somewhere. So it is definitely somebody will have to lose and somebody will win. We can try and equalize some of those winners and losers out, but the risk factors, when you look at those LEAs that were going to fail, I'm going to tell you it's the LEAs with the most significant risk factors that are going to go first, because they have the most needy population. We started running the KEEP data this week, and what we're finding is we have some LEAs that are having 25% of their kids come in ready for kindergarten. That's very substantial compared to an LEA that has 94%. I mean, that's our range, 25 to 94. Risk factors matter, unfortunately, drastically in education outcomes. And so looking at, are those risk factors where we want to spend our time and energy, or do we want to have a base that everybody gets the same, is definitely the conversation that we would love your support and direction on.
And I mean, and it also goes to those schools that have higher populations of K-3 students and those schools and LEAs that have higher risk factors. Do we want to send more money their way to help combat some of those issues that they're dealing with, which is not a consideration currently in the funding formulas that we're having. So it's a shift. And we would like direction from you.
Superintendent Dixon, and then.
Yeah, this, if I may just follow up from Board Member Hanson's comment, because I think it's important. We've been in conversations with various groups about rated funding, and it's been going on for some time. What we haven't done is really to have this conversation with you very publicly and run some scenarios. So it's always a really great idea in concept to braid funding, but and then when you put hard data to it, then you have to make some hard decisions as well. So we felt it was really important for you to be at the head of this conversation rather than after the fact. And I want to give Ms. Barrett kudos for running all these scenarios. And I know that she's somewhat of a perfectionist and trying to make sure that base was right, and just, kept kind of running and rerunning to try and get this right for you all to have some decision points. The good news is that by seeing this, it now provides you with additional data to have these hard conversations. And today's not a decision point, but certainly an input scenario for you to guide us moving forward. And we do have LEAs that have been having these conversations as well. They would like the flexibility, but then what does it mean? What does it really mean for them when the dollars roll out? What are the trade-offs? So it's not an easy conversation, but we can choose to keep having the conversation or do something different. We certainly know that the data is not, we're not moving the needle in the data. So we just so appreciate you being willing to hear this first, and we did that strategically. We feel like the board should have this information before we move outside of the circle.
And then if I just might add, we're still managing expectations, and this is a work session. So now I think you've done a really good job with these scenarios. If we're confused as board members, we know who we can go to help get clarity. But I guarantee you, because this is out there, that the LEAs out there are going to be contacting you, and they're going to be lobbying, and because of the winners and losers that you see in these scenarios. But this is part of our job, is to network and talk through these issues. So thank you for the information. We're not making decisions today, but this certainly starts the discussion. We're still going into our funding the way that we had before. There's no way we're going to tweak something before the legislature this year. But hopefully maybe by June or something, as we progress in this dialogue, we'll be able to have clear direction on who and where, or is it sooner than that?
Yeah.
How soon is it? Help me understand.
These are moving along now. So there are conversations on the Hill. It's already been had in public ed appropriations.
I know, but
the word I had was that first week of session, this was coming. So,
but they had them last year too, and so I'm just facing the reality of our situation. If it can move faster, then it does. But you guys get ready for it. But I know what's going to come from all of our LEAs is, hey, whoa, and then they're going to go They're going to go to the Hill and to their legislators, and so we're just informed, but it's about managing everyone's expectations. Let me go around. Who hasn't spoke? Okay, Carol.
Jamie, would you just repeat? You made a comment about districts or LEAs with more students and with more. Just repeat again what you said, and then I get my question straight.
Sure. So depending on what funding formula we're talking about, they're right now either on a K-8 or a K-3. So when, for instance, charter high schools, a lot of these funding pots, charter high schools don't participate in because they don't have that population. So when you roll it into a WPU, now you're spreading it over a K-12 population instead of just a K-8 or a K-3. So now they receive funds where they weren't before. So it's a redistribution.
Right. And I guess what I heard, maybe I was trying to hear that, is not only is there a dilemma, but about more students, but then my druthers would be it also addresses the LEAs with more significant needs.
Correct. So depending on which funding formula we may be leaning towards, if you're looking at distributing it based on risk factors or on a K-3 population, you're then targeting those funds towards those LEAs that exhibit those characteristics.
Because I think it's always the WPU discussion. Follow up, is that okay? The WPU discussion is always about, well, look at Alpine, it has so many children, but one of my concerns is look at Salt Lake, it has such intense needs.
Well, and one thing that was really glaring for us as we were looking at this is we ranked the risk factors from highest to lowest. If you look, Granite has 16,540 students who exhibit those risk factors. The next closest school, I think, was Davis at 8,000. So Granite has almost double the students with risk factors, but yet they're not really receiving enough funds, or double the funds in essence, to help address those issues. So it was interesting when you start to look at the data and look at who's exhibiting what, and that may help in directing the conversation.
And to go back to the data, you saw the disaggregated groups. They are well underperforming the state average. So those are those risk factor groups that are performing 20-30% below their average state peer.
I'm going to go to Board Member Bolter. You had a...
I'm going to have to study this a lot, but I have a lot of concerns with this block grant, with all the scenarios, especially, some districts are losing good chunks. And then not only that, but there's some charter schools that would be losing 100% of their funding. And I'm failing to see how that makes anything equitable, because now we've created an complete inequality in these schools that are losing 100%. So I'm trying to understand. I understand helping kids, but some of these schools that are losing 100% also have struggling students. So what would we do in that sense?
Yeah, you probably know the numbers better than I do.
And these are just possible scenarios. This is not written in stone. If you have other ideas that you would like us to run other scenarios on, we're more than happy to run those and see what the outcomes are. This was just a first stab at...
Follow up. This is just as far as block grants, right?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Okay. Board Member Cannon.
And WPU.
Thank you. I represent Granite, and of course immediately looked at that first and noticed those number of students. I also represent Murray, and I couldn't see them on here. So I don't know if they just got left off.
I think they're further in the alphabet, even though they're not in alphabet.
Yeah, they're way down. Okay. Oh, so we're not alphabetical at all. Okay,
No, it's by district number.
Thank you. But so what I'm thinking is that we heard a report from the legislative auditor yesterday, and it talked about how we had done these programs, and we've ended up without anything to show whether or not they're effective. So I'm thinking, how do we respond to something like that? So we're now looking at reallocating all these programs and the money for these programs. And I'm thinking we need to begin with the end in mind. So we need to answer the question, why do we want to block all of these programs together and put these monies together? What end do we want to see? And how are we going to track whether or not the reallocation of these funds does that? So I'd love to see some of that information from you folks too. It would really help me make a decision. But why do we want to do this, and what end are we trying to reach by doing this, and how do we best do that, and how do we track and report that so that we can be responsible stewards of state money?
Bacon. Okay, while you're writing that down, Vice Chair Brittany Cummins.
Can I ask 5 questions? And
5 questions?
Oh, yeah, at least. I've got a few. I've been writing them down.
I think.
But I want to speak to what Janet just said, and possibly.
Okay, so
what
but
Michelle,
to answer the question, if we just want to get a quick answer to that, so save this. Superintendent, did you have a?
Well, yeah, I think we can answer those questions really quickly. The why is that LEAs are asking for flexibility, and as stated right at the beginning, the current funding streams are they're desperate, and you have to use money for a certain program. So the why is by braiding the funds, it gives LEAs more flexibility. The what for is our current targets versus our reality. We are not hitting our literacy targets. In fact, in some ways, we're going backwards. So we've got to do something differently. So the what for is the outcomes. And then the how is the tricky part, to your point, Board Member Cannon, that accountability piece of that, of how will we really know if all those funds are braided? How will we know what's making the difference? And we actually feel that we can look directly at the point to point of the connection between how LEAs are spending money and the kind of growth that they're getting, we feel like we can actually get a better handle on what's making a difference than we can now. So those are the 3 quick answers, but we can go in depth offline.
Brittany.
Okay. Can I do my 5 things? No, sorry. But at first blush, I'm really excited about this concept because I do think their presentation talked about the why, the how, and the what, because they talked about that the ability for an LEA to decide how and to target rather than saying we've got all these funding sources and we have to figure out how to use these funding sources separately. So it does feel at first, I have to look through it more, but at first it's really exciting. I guess the questions that I have are when Board Member Bolter asked about some charter schools are getting 100%. I'm curious if that's because we have some charters that are like a 6-12 school, and are they just losing their their class size reduction funding? Is that what's happening? And so I'd be curious to know what that means as far as where those numbers come from, if that's why they're losing 100%, right? And then I'm guessing you used just K3 populations for this data, and in your presentation you talked about the possibility of a K5 extension, and I'm curious if that would change any of this.
We didn't want to bring in like the extension without your approval. We can definitely run the numbers with a K5, K6 lens, like their elementary population. We just didn't want to start like putting the extensions without you saying, let's look at that extension. So we can run some different numbers on their elementary population rather than their K3 population.
And then is there any intention in this proposal to add a growth mechanism as far as the funding goes? So would the intention be that this would be this block funding with a growth calculation?
We would like to see that if the board would be supportive. The growth has been a problem with K3 reading because there has not been growth. So it's just been a consistent decline over the years. So if we could put in a certain percentage of growth every year, that would be optimal in this program.
Okay.
Can I throw something? I know I'm interrupting you, but I'm looking at the time and a few other things. I know we have a lot of questions. I have questions. And so I think this was put together really well to create all these questions. So as we try to move this discussion further, does anyone on the board have, not that we're going to answer all these questions right now, is there anything that you want to add to this? Because where I think we need to go with this, because of the interest of time, is that, and I checked with the superintendent, and that's fine, that as board members have questions or have a proposed scenario, want to run a different kind of scenario, that we route those to Jennifer, and then all of us will be, as these answers are coming from you and your staff and the superintendent's staff, will all be receiving those answers. Because the more we get into this, the more we hear from our constituents, and that there's going to be a lot of questions. I know that Terry's back there, and this is going to be a big thing with superintendent, so I'll encourage Terry, as he's working with the superintendents, maybe, I'm sure somebody's going to be invited to talk or a little bit about this issue. And so as these things are happening, we continually be fed information. So when we get into our next work session, we can be better prepared, because there's going to be a lot of questions. Is there any objection to that approach, Superintendent? Do you have
I don't have an objection, but we will have Jennifer if you'll send out your contact information as well as Jamie's, and both your email and maybe phone contact.
Can it go in board
Okay.
docs?
And then we'll put it in board docs as well.
Are you
Board
satisfied
docs.
with that? You have your questions inventory. I'll come over here, Vice Chair Ellis.
I'm okay. I was going to let Carol take her time.
Okay. Board Member Reeby.
Yeah, I'd like to just state something that Linda had said. We are in a really mobile population, and I think as we start looking, as we're taking one from one district and moving it to another district, I don't think it's a district-to-district problem. I think it's a state problem, And we really need to address those resources to a state, because one of the superintendents says that only 40% of our students who start in one district finish in another district. So we should look at this as a state problem. And as we look at giving stipends to special education and teachers for those dire needs, we should probably also look at giving stipends to our students who have dire needs. So I think it's a different mindset, and we need to start thinking outside of the box. So I just wanted to share that. Thank you for this work. It's tremendous.
And just for the board, and we've got a few board members that aren't here, I'll reach out to them. They'll want to stay caught up on this, because it will hurt us as we're trying to move the discussion forward if their discovery happens way late in the game. Okay, Tammy, you have, I know, yeah, thank you. I saw you.
Can I just make a clarifying point? One of the board members had brought up the 100% decrease in funding, and what that is this particular schools that are either 6 through 12 or 7 through 12 grades, because we're focusing on K3, class size reduction is K8, so they get a little bit of funding for 7th and 8th grade or 6th, 7th, and 8th grade, whereas now as the funding formula changes to a K3, they lose those funds. So those are the only funds that they receive within those 3 pots of money.
But it is money that they're counting on.
Correct. I just wanted to explain.
Okay.
I don't know if this would be the opportunity, but it'd be great to know if literacy block seems to be the area for us to keep going on to get stakeholder input and things. I don't want to go in a direction you don't want.
Let me just give a little background on this. There are legislators that just want to roll it right up into the WPU.
Yeah.
And this is a way to not have that totally happen, to still have a
literacy focus.
some kind of literacy program. So I think the discussion is still really healthy and good to have. But well, let me jump over here. Terrell had something, and then back to you, Brittany.
Okay, so if the reading scores are kind of declining, are you doing any research? Because the information that I've read indicates that reading in some sort of technology format, we don't retain as much. Is that at all contributing to this? Where we're
with the
putting
potential
so much stuff into
ebooks
software.
It takes a different kind of thinking strategy, and so we have to teach kids differently how to retain or annotate or underline differently in a ebook than we do like a digital literacy component versus paper pencil. Any of you who read a book versus online, it's a different experience, and it takes a different set of skills. And so that digital literacy skill set, potentially, I mean, Sage is online, right? But many of our kids are reading in books, and so that it's a skill set difference. One thing we are seeing is our Sage is actually going up slowly, but we really are not reading any text at level of proficiency that's required by 50% of our kids, whether it's print or electronic.
Okay.
So I don't perceive it as a digital literacy issue.
Thank you for that
primarily.
clarification. Okay, so there's really not a difference because I see kids learning to read with little books, but if you're telling me that there's really not that much of a difference, I won't worry too much about that then.
I think it's a great question to ask, though, with our digital literacy.
Vice Chair Brittany Cummings.
So
This will be probably our ending.
Okay. And she just asked, if we're interested in this direction, and I believe it was part of our discussion yesterday, and I believe it was one of those items that we left on the list to move forward on our legislative list, if I remember correctly, as far as direction goes from the board.
So
okay. Thank you for
we'll be working with the superintendent to make sure that, so as the quicker you get, if you guys will jot your questions down before you forget, and the sooner we start addressing them, the better informed the board will be.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thanks for your time.
I'm sorry to end it. We've got another
We appreciate your time.
meeting. So
Thank you.
thank you for all your efforts. Yay. Okay. Board members, this concludes our study session. We're going to take a quick break while we get ready for USDB. Okay, so please, a quick break. Some people have time-sensitive things happening, so we want to get into our next meeting.